The next tribe of the Ingvaeones that we're going to cover are the Chalky, a group who later merged with the Saxons. Tacitus tells us this about them. The Chalky are the most noble of the Germanic peoples, a nation who maintain their greatness by righteous dealing. Without ambition, without lawless violence, they live peaceful and secluded, never provoking a war or injuring others by rapine and robbery. Indeed, the crowning proof of their valour and their strength is that they keep up their superiority without harm to others, yet all have their weapons in readiness, and an army, if necessary, with a multitude of men and horses. And even while at peace, they have the same renown of valour. Let us now mention the famous Battle of Teutoburg Forest, in which the Germanic forces, a confederation of tribes led by Arminius, annihilated 3 Roman legions in a surprise attack, taking 3 of the Romans' prized eagle standards, emblems of Jupiter and the pride of the legion itself. The Romans were known to have charged into suicidal fervour to recover these standards, and when some were lost in a battle against the Parthians, the Emperor Augustus's recovery of them was worthy of such celebration that in the centre of his most famous statue, on his breastplate, one can see the Parthians handing back the eagles. And after the loss of 3 of them in Teutoburg, an entire campaign was launched by the Romans just to recover these eagles. When the Romans invaded Germania a second time, not to occupy it, but to recover their eagles, the Chalky actually served as mercenaries in the Roman army against Arminius, though they were reported to have allowed Arminius to escape. It is perhaps for this reason that they were one of the only Germanic tribes who, following the events of Teutoburg, managed to maintain diplomatic relations with both their Germanic kinsmen and the Romans. A later incident involved the Chalky as judicators in a negotiation between the Romans and another Germanic warrior band made up of a handful of tribes, including the Chalky themselves, as well as Frisians and the rather amusingly named Caninifates, meaning leek masters, due to their cultivation of the vegetable farming being rather unusual for Germanic tribes. When the Roman general Corbulo met with the leader of this raiding band, Corbulo had him assassinated during the negotiations, an act of extreme treachery, prompting outrage not just from the Chalky and other Germanic tribes, but even from Emperor Claudius himself, who immediately ordered for all attacks on the Germans to cease, and for the Romans to return across the Rhine. Corbulo, the general who had organized this act of treachery, was later ordered to commit suicide. The Chalky had also been a large part of the aforementioned revolt of the Batavi, and curiously enough actually had warriors on both sides of the conflict, both parties fighting with bravery and distinction. However, all of this praise belongs only to those members of the Chalky living inland. There were another tribe living on the coast who were said to live without cattle or proper housing, who subsisted only on fish and petty banditry, resorting to seafaring piracy. In contrast to their brothers who lived in the heart of Germanic country, with their many cattle and good diets, regarded as the most noble of all the Germanic peoples, these coast dwellers did not receive the same admiration. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder tells us, "Here on the coast, a wretched race is found. Unlike the surrounding tribes, it is not their way to keep any flocks for sustenance by their milk, nor even to maintain the hunt of wild beasts, even every shrub being banished afar. With the sedge and the rushes of the marsh they make cords, and with these they weave the nets employed in their capturing of the fish. They fashion the mud, too, with their hands, and drying it by the help of the winds more than the sun, cook their food by its aid, and so warm their entrails, frozen as they are by the northern blasts. Their only drink, too, is rainwater, which they collect in holes dug at the entrance of their abodes." Now, While this could be taken as a Roman smugly looking down upon those he deems inferior, in my opinion it is instead a lesson on the importance of a good diet. The Indo-Europeans have historically survived on a diet of beef and milk, a pastoralist way of life maintained by even the Germanic peoples during the times of Caesar and Tacitus. Separate a people from their proper nutrients, and even the most noble of all the Germanic peoples could be reduced to destitute squalor and petty banditry. And with that, we can now move on to the next tribe of Germanic peoples, the Arminones. This group was a rather large grouping of tribes, many of whom you might be familiar with. These include the Suebi, Makamani, Lombards, Quadi, and Semnones. These tribes themselves were often large confederations in and of themselves, so to go into detail with each and every tribe would be rather difficult in the time we have. However, maybe in the future we could do an episode covering the individual tribes that we've missed if the interest is there. One thing that is important to discuss, however, is the name of the Arminones itself and what it means. Ermin is thought to mean the Great, and is a name that appears all over Germanic myth and history, often with a few variations in pronunciation and spelling, such as Herman, Herman, Erman, which was Latinized to Arminius, and the Norse Jormund. Ermin appears in the Poetic Edda as another name for Odin, but was also applied to the Germanic god Zeus, an obvious cognate with Zeus, the Sky Father. So it can be assumed that this name was originally an epithet, often, though not exclusively, applied to the gods. Jacob Grimm, of Brothers Grimm fame, likened the term with Jormungandr, the Great Snake, among other things. It's certainly an interesting name, especially within the context of the Ermin Sul, which means Great Pillar, and is either in reference to the pillar being erected to celebrate a great deed or great deity, or it is in reference to a god going by the title Ermin, to whom the pillar is dedicated. An Ermin Sul was not one specific monument, but rather a type of monument that was erected by Germanic peoples. The destruction of one of these sacred sites was a major propaganda move by Charlemagne during his wars against the Saxons and his attempts to Christianize them. The Ermin Sul destroyed by Charlemagne was said to be a large tree trunk in the open air, and the story is echoed by the later tale of St. Boniface defiling the Germanic monument, known as Dona's Oak. However, things become very interesting when we read the account of the Christian scholar Widukind, thought to be a descendant of the famous pagan revolutionary who instigated many rebellions against the Catholic Franks. He says that these pillars, thought to be dedicated to Odin, who the Saxons called Herman, were dedicated to the Greek god Hermes. However, he does this based on the similarities of the names alone. He says, in a manner that strikes us now as rather confused, "When morning was come, they set up an eagle at the eastern gate, and, erecting an altar of victory, they celebrated appropriate rites with all due solemnity, according to their ancestral superstition. To the one whom they venerate as their god of victory, they give the name of Mars, and the bodily characteristics of Hercules, imitating his physical proportion by means of wooden columns, and in the hierarchy of their gods, he is the sun, or as the Greeks call him, Apollo. From this fact, the opinion of those men appears somewhat probable who hold that the Saxons were descended from the Greeks, because the Greeks call Mars Herman or Hermes, a word which we use even to this day, either for blame or praise, without knowing its meaning. First of all, the idea of the Saxons being descendants of the Greeks is, I would personally say, rather baffling, and may come from their enemies the Franks, claiming descent from the Trojans. Second, Mars and Hermes are obviously not the same deity, as we have spoken about in episode 4, but rather Hermes has always been equated with Odin, who is here being called Herman. This more obvious equation seems to have been completely missed by Widukind, and while it may well just be a coincidence that the two sound alike, they are still referring to the same god, which is very interesting indeed. So with all that said, what does the name Erminones actually mean? Well, it either means the Great Ones, possibly in reference to either their prowess or the sheer vastness of the smaller tribes belonging to this group, or, more likely, they considered themselves the descendants of a god or demigod going by the title Ermin, most probably whoever sat at the head of their pantheon at the time, be that Odin or the Skyfather. Now, let us delve into one of the tribes within this larger group. The first that we'll cover is the Cherusci, one of the most important tribes in the history of the Germanic peoples, yet also one of the least discussed. The Germanic tribe from whence Arminius hailed were the Cherusci, but the loyalty of the tribe was not so clear-cut. The leader of the tribe was a man named Segestes, and Arminius was his son-in-law. Arminius, a Roman citizen who had served with distinction in the Roman army, advocated for breaking away from Rome, whereas Segestes wished to continue cooperating with the Romans. When Arminius began plotting what would later become the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, Segestes repeatedly sent word to the Romans that rebellion was brewing. This warning was ignored, and the Romans lost around 20,000 men to a relentless Germanic onslaught, a defense of their tribal homelands so fierce that it halted Roman advance into Europe forever. The Cherusci, in the midst of all this, were fighting their own civil war that eventually ended up with Arminius laying siege to the fortress of Segestes, who was eventually saved by Roman reinforcements. He, along with his family, including Arminius' pregnant wife, were made Roman citizens and given plots of land in reward for their loyalty, whereas Arminius would rather tragically be slain by his own Cherusci kinsmen, being deemed too ambitious. The Germanic tribesmen who fanatically held on to their independence by any means necessary, beginning to fear that Arminius sought to create his own German empire to rival that of Rome by unifying all of the tribes under his rule. It is for this reason that I believe that the Cherusci were very nearly the most significant tribe in the history of Northern Europe, at least since the arrival of the Indo-Europeans. A German empire that unified such a vast area and such strong, indomitable people would have been a force to have been reckoned with for any empire. It's one of history's great what-if moments. What if the First German Reich had been under Arminius, a man who already knew all of the strengths and weaknesses of the Roman Empire in its prime, who had the chance to forge one shaped by uniquely Germanic ideals and characteristics, rather than that of Charlemagne, a man who made his destruction of European culture part of his propaganda, and the Pope, who needs no introduction. Ultimately, this idea of a German empire, one shaped by uniquely German ideas and a Germanic sense of the divine, would not be realized for millennia. Instead, having torn themselves apart, the two strongest and most competent leaders going to war with one another. After Arminius was slain by his own kinsmen, the Cherusci dedicated themselves to peace at any cost, and eventually faded into irrelevance. Tacitus tells us, dwelling on one side of the Chalky and Chatty, the Cherusci long cherished, unassailed, an excessive and exhausting love of peace. This was more pleasant than safe, for to be peaceful is self-deception among lawless and powerful neighbours. Where the strong hand decides, moderation and justice are terms applied only to the more powerful, and so the Cherusci, ever reputed and just, are now called cowards and fools, while in the case of the victorious Chatty, success has been identified with prudence. The downfall of the Cherusci brought with it also that of the Foci, a neighbouring tribe which shared equally in their disasters, though they had been inferior to them in prosperous days. Let the fate of the Cherusci stand as a warning to those who would fight their brothers with the enemies at the gates. once on the cusp of forming the first German Empire. Within 100 years they had lost everything. It would seem that "no more brother wars" is a phrase that should have been in use far longer. Ultimately, we would see a Germanic empire styled like that of Rome, playing to the strength and character and traditions of the Germanic people, while avoiding the pitfalls that Rome had fallen into, but it was ultimately short-lived. Nevertheless, this is not the place for such discussion. One final interesting story concerning the Cherusci is that of their interactions with another well-known Germanic tribe known as the Makamani. They were a branch of the Swabian people, who we will be delving into shortly. The Makamani were no friends of the Romans, nor of Arminius, but when Arminius sent their leader the severed head of the Roman general he had defeated at Teutoburg, the leader of the Makamani was utterly appalled and sent back the head to Rome so that the general, or his head at least, could receive a proper burial. A fine example of the honour shown by Germanic warriors, even to their defeated enemies. And now we come to one of the most famous, as well as one of the largest Germanic tribes of all, the Suebi. They are perhaps deserving of their own video, as they eventually became so large and powerful that they split off into several other famous Germanic tribes, and the name Swabi, or Swabian, was at one point going to replace the Latin word German. It's worthy of note that none of the Swabians ever took part in the war between Rome and Arminius, but they later ended up waging war on both of them at different times. Germanic peoples had waged war against the Cherusci after years of bad blood between the tribes, and invaded North Italy during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, and the Alemanni invaded Gaul during the crisis of the 3rd century. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Suebi or Swabians, possibly in connection to occult conspiracy theories and the like, but what does Swabi actually mean? It's derived from the Indo-European word "swe", meaning one's own, a word that exists in Polish, Latin, and Sanskrit, and can be found throughout European history. The Swabi being the most obvious, there are also the Swenones, from which we get the name Swedes. And curiously enough, the famed semi-legendary Latin people who fought against Romulus and his Romans in the founding myth that we will cover later, the Sabines, also took their name from this Proto-Indo-European word. It is astounding that a word from so long ago has been so consistently used to refer to one's own people or nation even into the modern day, the word and its meaning and even its context being preserved. This is ultimately the meaning of the name of Sweden, both in English and Swedish, meaning land of our own people. In fact, the term has been carried even into modern Scandinavian, with the word for brother-in-law being svaga, and svagerska being sister-in-law, implying someone who has been made into one's own, having joined the family. But we will return to the Scandinavians and my butchering of their language later. The Swabians were written of by Caesar and Tacitus, but unfortunately, like most of the Germanic tribes, there is very little written of their origins, just that they appeared seemingly from nowhere. It is also difficult to pin down a precise moment in which their national character was displayed, as they broke off into so many different groups, all of whom had moments of their own that defined them. As we have said previously, it is impossible to delve into all the Germanic tribes in a single video, but if there is interest, we could possibly make such a video in the future. Still, I would recommend that you instead pick up a copy of Germania by Tacitus, as he has done a finer job than most in cataloguing all of the different tribes and the customs that both united them and made them stick out from the rest of their kin. For now, we will mention their appearance in the Norse myth, their kingdom, and their wars with the Visigoths. In Norse mythology, the name of one of the Valkyries is Svafa, which is the Old Norse word for Swabian, As well as this, there is also the Rö runestone, one of the oldest runestones in Sweden, which was carved either by or at the request of a Swabian warrior. It reads, I, Rathas, raised the stone, Swabian warrior with wide wounds, the stone guard carved. Clearly, the Swabians have had a significant impact on the history of the Germanic and European peoples. What was their lifestyle like? And more importantly for us, what kind of traditions did they keep to? Well, first of all, there is the rather famous hairstyle worn by the Suebi, the Swabian knot, that was said to distinguish the freedman from the slave. Skulls of men have been found still wearing the symbol of their ancient Germanic nobility, their knots still intact after all these years. Their lifestyle also differed in many ways from the other Germanic peoples. They were, according to Caesar, the largest and most warlike of all the Germanic peoples. They lived as nomads, wearing animal skins and forbidding things they saw as encouraging greed or weakness. For example, wine was outlawed amongst them, despite all forms of alcohol being rather popular in most other ancient societies, including those of the ancient Proto-Indo-Europeans. Their diet contained no grains, with them subsisting on cattle grazing and hunting. Much like the ancient Indo-Europeans of old, their diets consisted of meat and dairy. They forbade trade in almost any capacity. The only trade that was allowed was the trading of war booty taken in raids and conquest. These traded items were things that were either outlawed or of no use to these Swabian warriors. These men were not allowed to own their own private land. Something that might sound a little communist until you learn that no man was allowed to stay on the same patch of land for more than a year. These people were very nomadic, retaining their old pastoralist nomad ways far longer than even the other Germanic tribes, who began to settle down into villages and settlements. It seemed that this was to their disadvantage. As we have already mentioned, Tacitus called the Chalky the most noble of the Germanic peoples due to their reluctance to make war on others for territorial or material gains. However, it was the Swabi who were said to have dedicated 100,000 men for the pursuit of warfare alone. This policy of seemingly perpetual warfare, rather than thinning their ranks and leaving behind only widows and orphans, seemed to increase their power above all Germanic peoples, making them hardy and fearless. Though their warriors might have lacked the regimented military discipline of the legions of Rome or the phalanx of Alexander, it was clear that the lifestyles of these men, forbidding any creeping in of weakness or complacency, was highly disciplined indeed. It seems that they were far from being the lawless, savage beasts they are often portrayed as. Later on in their history, the Swabians set up their own kingdom in what is now northwest Spain and northern Portugal. This kingdom would go on to be rather prosperous in the wake of the collapsing of the Roman Empire, which had long since abandoned its traditions and split into two, the western half decaying rapidly. It is said that a few traces of the Swabic language remain in the tongues and dialects of the local peoples, and that the methods of farming in the lands of the old Swabian kingdom are quite different from those in the southern regions of those lands, taking their practices from the old rulers of those lands. Eventually, their kingdom would begin to fragment along several political and religious lines. The Christians, who wanted to convert the entire kingdom, and the pagans, who wished to remain true and loyal to their ancestral traditions. Eventually, the Swabian kingdom would become Catholic, before falling to the invasion of another Germanic people, the Visigoths, having gone from being a thriving kingdom to a mere province. The Visigoths, however, treated their conquered Germanic brothers with respect, and allowed them to retain their property and freedoms. Eventually, however, these once noble Swabians, who had abandoned the traditions of their ancestors and been reduced to a vassal of the Visigoths, mixed themselves out of existence, learning the local language and merging with the native Iberians. Only a few traces of their presence still remains, and the names of towns and the aforementioned presence of a few words in local dialects and farming techniques. This tribe had forsaken their own traditions, forsaken their own gods, and perhaps no longer saw themselves as a unique people with traditions to preserve. With the advent of Christianity's so-called universal love, these people clearly did not see their ethnic identity as being as important as it had been during their pagan past. There are a few tribes within the Suebi who are worth mentioning due to their individual merits, the first of which were the Sinoni Tribe, who were renowned even in the days of Tacitus for being master shipbuilders, a talent that would later serve them very well when the Swinones became the Swedes, the Viking warriors, sailing some of the best ships of their day. Shipbuilding was an ancestral tradition for the Swedes, but we will discuss the Swinones in the next part of the episode, when we will look into the founding myths of the Nordic and Scandinavian peoples. Another Swabian tribe worthy of mentioning is the Harii, a tribe infamous amongst the Germanics for their unusual method of fighting. At night, they would paint themselves black and carry black shields and short swords, and then attack their unsuspecting enemies. Tacitus tells us, "As for the Harii, quite apart from their strength, which exceeds that of the other tribes I have just listed, they pander to their innate savagery by skill and timing. With black shields and painted bodies, they choose dark nights to fight, and by means of terror and shadow of a ghostly army they cause panic, since no enemy can bear a sight so unexpected and hellish. In every battle, the eyes are the first to be conquered." It is thought by some scholars that it was these men who gave rise to the tales of the Wild Hunt and the Einherjar, although I would say that these two have a much more spiritual and symbolic meaning. Nevertheless, it's easy to see how men with such a terrifying presence, seeming to appear from nowhere and fall upon their enemies, inflicting sheer terror upon the ranks, could have stayed within the psyche of a people and found its way into mythology. Though we do not have time to explore the entirety of the information on the Einherjar and the Wild Hunt, a brief explanation is most certainly in order. The Einherjar are the slain warriors who Odin took into Valhalla. They feast upon the meat of an immortal boar that is resurrected daily and are served mead by the Valkyries. There in Valhalla, they are said to prepare for the coming battle of Ragnarok, awaiting their fates as warriors in the service of Odin. To quote the Poetic Edda, "All the Einherjar fight in Odin's courts. Every day they choose the slain and ride from battle. Then they sit more at peace together." The Wild Hunt is something I would love to talk about in detail, as it's just a fascinating tale and an insight into the minds of the Europeans of the time. It was a band of shadowy warriors led by a figure typically given as Odin, and the story is told throughout Germany, Poland, Scandinavia, and Britain, albeit with slight variations. It is very easy to see how, at the very least, the depictions of these men, shadowy warriors in service to Odin, could have been inspired by these men of the Harii. After all, it is thought that these young men, who dyed themselves black and plunged into battle, were themselves part of a cult of Odin, in his capacity as the god of battle frenzy, and this later became legend amongst the Germanic peoples, who spoke of a cult of war-crazed men who appeared from nowhere like ghosts in the night, following Odin wherever he might appear.